Playing horror games during the day is one thing, but late at night, when you're alone, wearing headphones, and every light in the room is off, horror games start to hit completely different. If you think you can handle it, here are the top 15 horror games you should only play alone at night. Starting with Daymare 1994, Sandcastle. This one is a third-person survival horror prequel to Daymare 1998 from Invader Studios. And if you missed the older Resident Evil-style games, this is very clearly going for that vibe. You play as Delilah Reyes, a former government agent sent into a secret research facility near Area 51, where things quickly turn into a complete nightmare. The game mixes shooting, puzzles, and resource management with a pretty strong sci-fi horror atmosphere. One thing that helps it stand out is the frost grip weapon, which lets you freeze enemies before shattering them apart. It gives the combat a little extra personality instead of just unloading bullets into everything. It's definitely one of those AA horror games that feels inspired by the classics while still trying a few ideas of its own.
He can't have betrayed us.
That data can't be allowed to leave here. The living and the dead have contributed with their light, or the whole world will burn.
Curious soul dares to wander into my sanctum, the last bastion of true art in this forsaken world.
Let us not forget the sacrilege that has been committed against our nation.
They don't speak unless you listen closely.
Oh yes, they whisper to me.
Beyond Hanwell is a first-person survival horror game set in a dark version of London, and it actually leans way harder into combat than people might expected. You're not just walking around waiting for jump scares. The game gives you melee weapons, firearms, and some pretty brutal close-range combat. The gameplay really gives off old Condemned vibes. You're scavenging whatever you can find, fighting horrifying creatures in abandoned buildings and subway tunnels, and trying to survive with limited resources. One thing that makes it stand out is the immersion. The game barely uses a HUD at all, so you're checking your weapon condition manually, counting bullets yourself, and relying on the atmosphere to figure out how bad things are getting. That already sounds stressful enough in a horror game. The casting of Frank Stone is basically what happens when Supermassive Games makes a Dead by Daylight horror game, which honestly already sounds like a pretty solid combo. So if you've played Until Dawn or The Quarry, you already know the type of game this is going for. Lots of choices, branching paths, and characters that can absolutely die if you mess things up. The story follows a group of young filmmakers exploring an abandoned steel mill connected to this serial killer named Frank Stone, and the whole thing slowly starts turning into a complete nightmare tied directly to the Dead by Daylight universe. What I like is that it still feels cinematic, but there's a heavier horror atmosphere compared to some of Supermassive's recent games. The abandoned locations look creepy, the sound design is pretty solid, and some of the creature scenes genuinely feel disturbing in that classic Dead by Daylight way.
To see young people so passionate about the arts. Everything's all right. Either of you heard of Murder Mill?
No! No!
There was a whole string of disappearances. Kidnappings, really. Murders.
So what was this guy's name?
I don't think the police ever found this place.
Fuck!
Whoever did this might still be here. We can't stay, okay? We gotta go.
And...
Project Songbird looks like one of those indie psychological horror games that could end up being way bigger than people expect. You play as a musician named Dakota, staying alone in a remote cabin deep in the Appalachian forest while trying to finish a new album, which already sounds like the setup for something terrible to happen. The game mixes exploration, psychological horror, and cinematic storytelling while these increasingly disturbing things start happening around the woods. And from the footage so far, it looks less focused on cheap jump scares and more focused on slowly making everything feel wrong the longer you play. Visually, it also has a really strong atmosphere. The forests, dark interiors, it all gives off that isolated horror vibe where you feel completely cut off from everything.
I've heard a lot of stories of musicians retreating away for a bit to get out of their element. And these guys come out of it having written the best music of their lives. I just thought that if you were willing, I'll give you the directions and I'll give the guy notice that you could be staying all next month. I just thought maybe you'd like to take the time away to get an album out. A new classic Neon Songbird album. Now the place isn't exactly 5-star. You'll be living a bit off the grid, but I don't know. You can show everyone that you've still got it.
Eternal Evil is one of those games where you can instantly tell the developers grew up with old-school survival horror. The second you see the inventory management, the limited ammo, and those creepy monster designs, you already know exactly what kind of game this is. It's a first-person survival horror game set during this outbreak where an entire town starts turning into ghouls, and the combat actually looks way more brutal than I expected. You've got realistic gunplay, dismemberment, melee weapons, and enemies that apparently keep evolving the further you get, which honestly sounds stressful in the exact way survival horror should be. The interesting thing is a lot of people seem to like it specifically because it feels old school and unapologetically difficult. Some players even straight up call it a hidden gem survival horror game, despite the rough edges. Go Home Annie is a psychological horror game set in the SCP universe, which already gives it a pretty unfair advantage if you're into weird paranormal horror stuff. You play as Annie, a low-level SCP employee testing replicated paranormal events inside this massive facility where literally nothing feels normal. What makes the game stand out is how much it leans into strange anomalies and puzzle solving instead of constant combat. One minute you're walking through a normal-looking room, and then suddenly reality starts bending in ways that make absolutely no sense. Apparently there's even a camcorder mechanic that lets you see objects from another dimension, which is exactly the kind of SCP nonsense I want from a game like this. Some people compared parts of it to Bloober Team-style horror games, especially with the slower pacing and psychological elements.
You are a T-class tester. Tests paranormal entities that we have replicated here.
You have got to be kidding me. I know this place. We are at the heart of the spiral where worlds collide.
Song of Horror is one of the few modern horror games that actually feels genuinely unpredictable. Like, the game has this entity called the Presence, and it basically acts like an AI director whose entire job is ruining your life in different ways every time you play. The whole thing is very inspired by old-school survival horror. Fixed camera angles, puzzle solving, creepy mansions, all that stuff is here. But the big twist is permadeath. If a character dies, they're just gone permanently, and the story continues with somebody else. So every bad decision suddenly feels way more stressful than usual. And I actually like that the game doesn't rely too heavily on combat either. Most of the tension comes from trying to survive encounters with the Presence through panic mechanics and quick reactions.
With that cursed music box.
lava.
Good. Time to play detective.
What is this?
Supernatural is one of those indie horror games where the main gimmick alone already makes it interesting. The game literally uses your microphone while you play, and apparently, the louder you react, the more intense the paranormal events can get. Which honestly feels like a very mean thing for a horror game to do. You play as Detective Wyatt, investigating the disappearance of a housemaid inside this haunted house, and the whole game leans heavily into psychological horror, puzzle solving, and exploration instead of non-stop action. The interesting part is how much the game tries to mess with your nerves through sound. Whispers, footsteps, random noises, your own microphone input, it all becomes part of the horror. And because the paranormal events can happen dynamically, players were saying some moments genuinely caught them off guard, even when they thought they knew what the game was doing.
Where are you?
Okay, this fucking time, I won't let anyone escape.
Where are you?
Can I leave?
We're not stuck or lost, no. We are right where we are supposed to be.
Is this hell?
Hell would have meaning. No, this is just us and our queen.
You think you can escape what you've done?
I think I can try.
Post-Trauma is one of those horror games that takes one look at classic Silent Hill, and honestly, the second you see the environments, you can immediately tell that's the vibe they're aiming for. You play as a train conductor named Roman, who wakes up trapped inside this surreal nightmare world full of grotesque creatures and bizarre locations that barely feel real. The gameplay mixes exploration, puzzle solving, inventory management, and combat, although combat definitely looks more tense than empowering. A lot of the enemy encounters feel like the kind where you're constantly deciding whether fighting is even worth the resources. And the puzzles actually seem like a pretty big focus too. Not just find keycard, open door type stuff either. Some of them look very inspired by older psychological horror games where the solution barely makes sense until your brain suddenly connects everything together 20 minutes later. Karma, The Dark World, is one of those psychological horror games where the setting alone already does a lot of the heavy lifting. The game takes place in an alternate version of East Germany, ruled by this giant corporation called Leviathan, and everything has this oppressive, Orwellian, Big Brother is watching you vibe hanging over it the entire time. You play as Daniel McGovern, basically a special agent whose job is diving directly into people's memories to investigate crimes. Which already sounds like something that absolutely cannot end well in a horror game. Gameplay-wise, it's mostly first-person exploration, puzzle solving, environmental storytelling, and occasional chase sequences rather than non-stop combat. A lot of the horror comes from walking through these completely twisted environments while trying to piece together what's actually real.
What happened to me? Am I
Amenti is one of those first-person horror games that immediately gets your attention just from the setting alone, because instead of another haunted house or abandoned hospital, this thing drops you inside ancient Egyptian tombs. You play as a photographer and historian, exploring these ruins after discovering the entrance to an untouched tomb. Which, look, horror games have taught us many things over the years, and Don't Open the Ancient Cursed Tomb is definitely somewhere near the top of the list. Gameplay-wise, it's mostly exploration, puzzle solving, and survival while navigating these dark tunnels with only limited tools and light sources. The game leans really hard into atmosphere too. Sand-covered hallways, ancient traps, narrow spaces, strange figures appearing in the distance. It all has that claustrophobic horror vibe where you constantly feel trapped underground. Pneumata is one of those survival horror games that very clearly wants to make you uncomfortable the entire time you're playing it. The game takes place inside this apartment complex called Clover Hill, where people are disappearing, bodies are showing up in impossible places, and your character is slowly losing grip on reality. So yeah, not exactly a relaxing apartment experience. Gameplay-wise, it mixes first-person exploration, shooting, inventory management, puzzle solving, and survival horror mechanics in a way that feels very inspired by Resident Evil 7 and old-school psychological horror stuff. The interesting thing is how much the game leans into paranoia and hallucinations. You're constantly finding disturbing notes, strange recordings, hidden passageways, and these grotesque creatures that sometimes feel like they came straight out of somebody's nightmare. Silent Hill F is probably one of the most interesting directions this series has taken in a long time, mostly because it's not even set in Silent Hill anymore. Instead, the game takes place in 1960s Japan, inside this rural town called Ebisugaoka, where things slowly start turning into absolute nightmare fuel after a strange fog rolls in. You play as a teenage girl named Hinako Shimizu, and from everything they've shown so far, this one seems way more focused on psychological horror, disturbing imagery, exploration, puzzle solving, and melee combat, rather than heavy action. The combat actually looks pretty brutal too. Pipes, axes, knives, a lot of close-range stuff where enemies feel way too close for comfort. And visually, this game looks insane sometimes. Flowers growing out of bodies, skin peeling apart, twisted shrine-like environments. It has this really unsettling mix of beauty and horror that feels very different from older Silent Hill games, while still somehow fitting perfectly.
夢の中ってことはないよな。ひなこ、もう時間がないのよ。あなたが生かされたということは、ここに至ってもまだ迷いがあるということなのね。あなたがそれに悩める時間はもう尽きかけている。
あなたは誰なの？さっきからなんで何もわからないふりをしているの？私はね、あんたをすぐに殺す。
You're fired. Hear me? Fired.
Jesus, Gregor! Gregor!
Still Wakes the Deep is a first-person horror game set on an oil rig in the middle of the North Sea back in the 1970s, which already sounds like a terrible place to be even before the horror starts. You play as an electrician named Kaz, trying to survive after something goes horribly wrong on the rig. And from there, the whole place slowly turns into complete chaos. The game comes from the Chinese Room, the studio behind Amnesia, A Machine for Pigs, and Everybody's Gone to the Rapture. So atmosphere is very clearly the main focus here. A lot of the gameplay revolves around exploration, climbing through collapsing sections of the rig, swimming through flooded corridors, hiding from creatures, and trying not to fall into the freezing ocean below. There's no real combat either, which honestly makes everything feel even more stressful. Most of the time, you're just trying to survive while this thing stalks people across the rig. And the environment itself becomes half the horror. Visage is honestly one of the best horror games we've gotten in years, especially if you're into slow psychological horror that just constantly gets under your skin. The game takes a lot of inspiration from PT. The whole game takes place inside this massive haunted house where you explore different chapters tied to the people who died there. Gameplay mostly revolves around searching rooms for keys and important items, solving puzzles, managing limited resources like lighters and pills, and trying to survive paranormal encounters while the house slowly becomes more aggressive. And the sanity mechanic is a huge part of the gameplay too. Staying too long in darkness starts draining your sanity, which causes more supernatural events to happen around you. There's also no real combat, which makes every encounter feel worse because most of the time, your only options are hiding, running, or hoping the thing chasing you goes away.